Hello and welcome to the Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy and I love history and travel. If you're new here, I'm very glad to meet you. Valletta was the first planned city in Europe from some points of view and was built on the spine of the Scriberras peninsula, so there are plenty of steps and changes in elevations of the roads. The streets are surprisingly straight considering that the area was originally defensive in nature. After the Knights of St. John Hospitaller managed to hold off the best of Suleiman the Magnificent's forces during an essentially unrelieved 4-month siege in 1565, the knights, who had originally sheltered across the harbor in the area around Burgoo, decided to build something bigger, better, and far more defensible. Valletta was the result. Join me as we take a walk among the defenses and some of the other sites in this glorious city today on the Armchair Traveler. The Great Siege of 1565 was not Malta's last time at the rodeo. The country withstood a second siege, an aerial bombardment campaign designed to obliterate the remaining Allied airfields in the area. The population of the islands lived in caves and tunnels and nearly starved. The Italians, acting as proxies for the Germans, had good reasons to want to obliterate resistance on the island. British air and sea forces based on the island could and did attack Axis ships transporting vital supplies and reinforcements to North Africa. Churchill called the island an unsinkable aircraft carrier. General Erwin Rommel, de facto field commander of the Axis forces in North Africa, recognized how important and dangerous it was, at least to him, in part because his famed Africa Corps frequently stalled because of lack of fuel and water. As it turned out, they were both correct. The siege continued until November and December of 1942, when it was finally broken by the arrival of an Allied convoy with supplies. For its grit and determination, King George VI of the United Kingdom honored the entire island with the highest possible English award, the George Cross. An association was created by veterans and families who survived the siege of Malta during the war, and is responsible for building the siege bell, which you see here, to honor those who went before and saved the islands. You'll recall from our last visit that Malta is basically a rock with very thin soil and limited agricultural capability. Much food is imported, even during the time of the Knight Hospitallers. The Knights built huge underground silos that cut into the rock. They understood that sooner or later Suleiman, justifiably annoyed by the Knights' continued raids on his shipping, would come gunning for them and planned to have enough food stored away so that no matter what else happened, they wouldn't starve. When you walk around the fort, you can see caps in the stone pavement. I nearly tripped over one of them. Each of these covers up a bell-shaped reservoir that could be sealed shut with mortar in order to guarantee that the grain would stay dry and not spoil. Today, the space around Fort Saint Elmo is mostly used by picnicking families in warmer months, when an ice cream van can often be seen nearby. The two concrete block buildings you see on the left are anti-aircraft gun towers that dated from World War II. As I mentioned earlier, Erwin Rommel noted even before he was forced from Africa that many of his supply problems involved the pesky British and Maltese resistance on that island. The Axis powers were resolved to bomb or starve the country into submission, to soften it up for an eventual invasion by attacking the ports, towns, cities, and Allied shipping nearby. Malta was one of the most intensively bombed areas of the war. The Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, flew a total of 3,000 bombing raids, dropping 6,700 tons of bombs on the Grand Harbor area alone. On the right, I took a beverage break after tramping through the old fort. Old Bakery Street manages to achieve a feat that I thought was geographically impossible. It slants uphill in both directions. Seriously downhill one way, seriously uphill the other way. Notice that the building facades are constructed almost exclusively of native stone. Those balconies, which are quite attractive, are generally made of wood. All of the wood had to be imported. When I visited, the city was in the middle of a building boom. I was told that many of the old mansion houses, including my hotel, had originally been single owner and were rapidly being converted to hotels and condo spaces to take advantage of all the newcomers who were flocking to Malta, in part because once they achieved Maltese citizenship, all you had to do was buy a house and live there for a couple of years. they would be eligible to have golden EU passports. Unfortunately, in this part of the city, there isn't much regulation of vehicular traffic, and much of the time cars actually park on the sidewalks, forcing intrepid tourists like me into the street. One of those old single-owner buildings was my home base for my stay here in Valletta. It's called Ashkla Mansion. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly or not. It was limited in some respects in that there was no front desk. I had to track somebody down at another apartment house to get a key. The cleaning lady was very nice, and there was an elevator. I can only assume it had been converted fairly recently. The rooms were perfectly adequate, the air conditioning seemed to work, the location was great, and there was even a rooftop terrace. I really liked it. When I return, I'd be more than willing to stay here again. I have to admit, I also really enjoyed looking at those tiles. Bakery Street draws its name from the one-time bakery of the Guildmaster built along this stretch in the 16th century. There were several bakeries that produced bread for the inhabitants of Valletta and the surrounding area, as well as for the order's garrison and the Navy. The street extends all the way from the walls of Fort Saint Elmo to the city gates, and is one of the main streets in the city. It is not pedestrianized. Valletta sits on a kind of spine on the Scriberras peninsula, which means that to access the streets on either side of it, you either climb up or you climb down. The photographs of the alley leading to my hotel, the name of the hotel means eagle in Maltese, shows this pretty well. Uphill and downhill views were snapped from the apartment hotel entrance, which you can see on the lower right. Left are the rather formidable steps leading from Old Bakery Street to the entrance. I gave the taxi driver a really big tip to get him to carry my suitcase down those steps because I had a kink in my back. On the top right are even more steps, this time fortunately with a handrail, but also plenty of construction debris leading down to Gentis Street. Unlike many of the other Knights establishments, the Grandmaster's Palace, shown here, normally just called the Palace, was built between the original development of the city just after the Great Siege, and construction lasted well into the 18th century. When the Knights had been expelled from Malta by Napoleonic France, the Grandmaster's Palace became their national palace. During the period of British rule, beginning in 1800, it was the Governor's Palace. It remained the seat of the legislature until 2014, when the new Parliament House, which we'll visit at the end of our tour, was completed. It now serves mostly as a museum. The main facade, shown here, is quite plain and unadorned except for some grillwork. The style of the building is Mannerist. The facade and parts of the building were designed by a military architect we met earlier and a member of the Knights Hospitaller called Caesar. As you can see, the building facade is made of the same stone as the island. The inset on the top right represents just one phase of the palace's existence and design scheme. This picture postcard shows the palace painted with red ochre. Red ochre was a color used by the order to mark their public buildings. It certainly stood out better than the unrelieved sandstone of most of the rest of the city. Removing the paint was a judgment call by the people at the time. I'm not at all sure, however, it was a good idea. The red paint is how the Knights saw this place, and I think it's worthwhile to remember we should try to see things the way they saw them, not necessarily the way we think they ought to be. These are just 3 views of the decorations to the Grandmaster's Palace. The palace itself was under constant construction and embellishment, which is ongoing to this day. The interior now is of Baroque character. The ceilings of the main corridors, one of which is shown in my photo on the left, were decorated with frescoes by Niccolao Nalzoni back in 1724. On the top right you can see a small section of the elaborately inlaid marble floor with the knight's shield in that same hallway. Bottom right shows a fresco scene from one of the staterooms. The figure you see in the corner is just paint called trompe-l'oeil, which means fool the eye. On the left is a former meeting room for the Maltese Parliament, featuring among other things some very nice tapestries. If you hadn't already guessed, the Knights Hospitaller after the siege were fabulously wealthy. They could afford to, and did, buy the very best. When you think about it compared to modern government meeting areas, you can see that for all the history and glory of the decoration, the place was simply too small. On the right you see the so-called map room. Most of the palace is off limit to visitors, unfortunately, even though Parliament no longer meets in this location. The entire facility is still in the throes of a major renovation, and this year, in 2023, they discovered some abandoned hidden frescoes. Probably there's more to be unearthed. I was told the first plan was to upgrade the electrical and other systems to keep Parliament here, but it was abandoned as impractical. They could put in the power, they could put in the air conditioning, but without demolishing walls, there would be no way to fit everybody and their computers in there comfortably. Trompe-l'oeil, which I mentioned earlier, means fool the eye, and I think there's a good case to be made that this entire building is just that. This antique-looking structure sits on the site of the original Auberge d'Auvergne, just across the square from the Grandmaster's palace. When the knights eventually decamped, it was converted into the Court of Justice. Looks are deceiving. The Knights-era original building was completely destroyed by airstrikes during World War II, and this replica was completed in 1971. Although Malta has long since slipped from the grasp of the United Kingdom and is a full and equal partner in the Commonwealth, the Maltese do remember and honor their history. Here on the right you can see Queen Victoria sitting on top of a huge pedestal overlooking the Republic Square, with her back to the National Library and facing, at least during my visit, another one of Valletta's fun statues. You can learn more about those fun statues in a separate video here on my site. The tiny green sign to the left of the statue gives you the expression being illustrated, first in Maltese, then translated into English, with an explanation of the meaning, since literal translations often don't make much sense. In this case, the translation did make sense, in one ear and out the other. Did the local government put this artwork here as a jibe against the former queen, or against the rest of the Commonwealth? Or was it just a general expression of amusement and contempt for nonsense? The beauty of expressions is you get to decide for yourself. The Teatro Manuel was built by and named after one of the Grandmasters of the Order of the Knights Hospitaller. Construction began in 1731. The theater is said to be Europe's third oldest working theater. Logically enough, and much of this time logic doesn't much enter into the naming conventions, the theater is located on Old Theater Street. It has been under intermittent renovations for decades and was closed for performances when I visited. One of the most interesting features I read about was a unique way in dealing with acoustical issues. Full disclosure, I'm one credit short of an Associates of Arts degree in music and was always interested in sound and acoustics. I read that there are 2 large water reservoirs underneath the floor of the stage, which create an acoustic environment that is so precise that the hushed page turnings of an orchestra conductor can be heard clearly throughout the auditorium. I would have liked to have seen it, and next time I will. The Manuel Theater might be the oldest here in the city, but Valletta also boasted an opera house. The image you see on the top left shows the Royal Opera House in its heyday, about 1920. Looks are deceiving, and this building has led anything but a charmed life. It was initially designed and built in 1866 by an English architect named Edward Middleton Barry. Unfortunately, in 1873, the interior was extensively damaged by fire. It was eventually restored 4 years later. The theater continued operating until World War II, when it received a direct hit from an aerial bombing. There were several plans to rebuild and restore the theater, but they were all abandoned. Eventually, the ruins were incorporated into an outdoor music venue, redesigned by the Italian architect Renzo Piano, who also designed the new Parliament building and the city gates, which we'll visit next. Renzo Piano's breathtaking new Parliament building, shown here, was completed in 2014, just a few years before I visited. Its design includes huge volumes of stone that look suspended in air but are actually apparently supported on stilts. The rooftop features 600 square meters of solar panels, which is supposed to be enough to generate most of the energy required to heat the building in the winter, and more importantly, to cool it in the summer. Redesigning an area as big as this part of the city involves a lot of work, a lot of argument about what to include and what to get rid of, and also about how to do the work. The result we see here is Renzo Piano's comprehensive design and called Freedom Square. It includes some of the older buildings that had been there, the reconfigured former Opera House, the new Parliament building, and a reimagining of the city gates. On the left is a view from inside the square looking out toward the gates, with the Parliament House off to the left and the gates in the background. The gates are clearly symbolic nowadays. There would be no way to close them, but they still remind people of the older walls and their importance in the survival of this city. The effect of the square, whether you're looking out through the gates or inward, literally takes your breath away. I wanted you to see the difference, so I found an aerial photo of Republic Street, which dead ends at the present square. What you see here is a gigantic parking lot before it was closed and pedestrianized. I believe this photo was probably taken from the top of the old city gate. City walls and gates are serious parts of the fortification of the old city, built for strength and protection rather than for beauty. The main city gates, leading into the city from Floriana, were actually replaced in 2014 as a part of the rehabilitation and redevelopment of what is now called Freedom Square. You can see a view of the 1960s era gate, the originals from the 16th century are long gone, and a view looking inward from just outside the walls in the top image. The new gate really doesn't resemble what it replaced at all, but I've read it's supposed to look a bit more like the original entrance. Still, it doesn't have closing gates. From the outside, you do get the sensation of crossing a real bridge over the moat that originally dominated this part of the wall and this part of the island. The architecture is modernized and adapted to modern needs, but the materials still look a lot like the originals. You will recall that the peninsula on which Valletta sits is basically a rock. This looks like the same kind of rock. There's far more to see and do here in Malta than just visit Valletta, which is the only place I've taken you on this stop. On Easter Sunday 2018, I ventured across the Grand Harbor to visit the three cities, a museum, a church, and much more. Easter Sunday is a serious religious holiday here on the island, devoted to religious processions and pilgrimages. The streets literally vibrated with the bells. There were pageants and special events to mark all of Holy Week. Here you can see the celebration of the resurrection of Christ commemorated by carrying a statue into a nearby church. On Easter Sunday, the period of Lent's fasting and reflection comes to a vibrant end. I saw people in the streets very happy. The women were all dressed up to the nines, whether young or old. Many of the older men were also in suits, although the younger guys tend to favor the open collar look. After the services, they repaired to the many restaurants and bars that are available on each side of the city. The year I visited, there was an unfortunate incident documented in the Times of Malta talking about celebrants who managed to drop and damage a similar statue. Thank you for joining me on this visit to Valletta. There's a lot more to see here in the city and in the country, and we'll circle back to Valletta at the end of my 2018 trip series. But next we're going to push on to gorgeous, intriguing, and extraordinarily complex Sicily. I hope you'll join me there. If you think this content is interesting or useful, please like, share, and subscribe. This will help the channel grow. Travel content often involves a lot of history, and history can be really word heavy enough that the details often don't make it into a video blog. If you care to dig deeper, you can visit my regular blog on WordPress, where you'll find deep dives, travel tips, reviews, warnings, and the nuts and bolts on how to travel safely and conveniently. If you'd like to keep up with my posts, you can follow me on Twitter. The addresses are on your screen